Hello, and welcome back to One Idea Away. I'm Hayden, and before we get into the meat and bones of today's episode, I want to say something that might sound a little strange for a podcast about business and ideas. The person we're talking about today didn't really want to be in business, not in a conventional way. He didn't read the Forbes magazine growing up. He didn't dream about market share or becoming a big CEO or whatever. He wanted to climb rocks. That was his main goal. He wanted to sleep outside. He wanted to move through wild places and feel alive doing that. And yet, almost by accident, he built one of the most respected and genuinely unusual companies in modern history. That company is Patagonia, and the man behind that company is Yvon Chouinard. Today, we're going to spend a lot of time with his story, because I think his story holds something more than most business conversations have. Not just lessons about making a brand or sustainability or culture, though we'll talk about that too, I think, but something deeper, something about the relationship between what you love and what you build, and about what it actually means to run a business responsibly, and also about whether it's possible to succeed without becoming exactly the thing you set out not to be. So let's start at the beginning. Yvon Chouinard was born in 1938 in Maine to a French-Canadian family. His first language was French. His family eventually moved to California, and it was there, as a teenager, that he discovered climbing. And when I say he discovered climbing, I don't mean he took a weekend course, or he joined a club, or he just heard about it from a friend. He became consumed by it. By his late teens and early 20s, Chouinard was part of a loose community of climbers in California and beyond California, people who would later be called dirtbags in a sort of affectionate way. These are people who structured their entire lives around their ability to climb. They lived cheaply. They traveled all around. They slept in their cars. They slept in tents. They slept on the ground, all for the climb. Money was something you just needed to keep climbing. And Yosemite was the center of that world. Chouinard spent extended periods of time in Yosemite, sometimes weeks, months, climbing routes on famous peaks like El Capitan, exploring techniques, pushing the limits of climbing at the time. There's this famous image of what life in Camp 4 looked like during that era. It's almost like a beautiful chaos. Climbers literally living hand to mouth, focused on one thing and one thing only. And it was in this world where Chouinard started forging his own climbing equipment. The immediate reason was practical. He was a climber. Climbers need batons, the metal spikes you hammer into rock cracks that you anchor your ropes on so you don't fall off the mountain and die. And at the time, the most widely used batons were from Europe, and Chouinard thought that he could make better ones cheaper. So he taught himself how to blacksmith. He bought a used coal forge and a hand-cranked blower from a junkyard. He set up a shop. He started hammering metal, experimenting, improving on his batons. And then, as these things usually go, other climbers noticed. They wanted his batons too. So Chouinard started selling them out of the back of his car, at climbing spots, just pretty much through word of mouth through these dirt bags. And he charged $1.50 each for each baton he made. And essentially, he spent the late 1950s and early 1960s running this tiny business from the road. He would climb all season and then spend winters in his makeshift shop making a bunch of batons that he could sell for the next season. But here's the part of his story as a young business owner that I want you to hold on to. He didn't start his business and then look for a product. He had a craft, he had a community, he had a genuine love for an activity, and a product emerged from that. And then from that product emerged his business, almost as a byproduct of his love for something. And I think that sequence is what matters the most in his story. And that's a big idea we'll come back to. By the mid-1960s, Chouinard's little Patana operation had grown enough that he was selling climbing gear, like overall, with a partner, Tom Frost, under the name Chouinard Equipment. But even here, it's not like they were trying to build a corporation. They were just climbers who made things that other climbers wanted. But there was a problem. Chouinard Equipment became very good at making batons. In fact, by the late 1960s, they were one of the largest suppliers of climbing hardware in the United States. And that sounds like success, and in many ways it actually was, but Chouinard noticed something bad about this. The very product that had made him successful was damaging the rock faces he loved. Batons work by being hammered into cracks, and when you hammer something in and then hammer it back out over and over, As more climbers ascend and descend these same routes, those cracks get scarred and widened, the rock gets destroyed, and then the routes become unusable for the future. And Yosemite's most popular and most fun routes were showing some serious damage. And this posed a genuine dilemma for Chouinard. Chouinard equipment was thriving precisely because batons were in demand. To stop selling batons would mean walking away from the core of their business of climbing. But Chouinard couldn't ignore the issue that was plaguing the thing that he loved. So Chouinard made a decision that most companies would never make. He phased out his most successful product. Chouinard and Frost developed an alternative to this, a device called a chock, or a nut, which works by fitting into existing crack features without hammering. Now, this nut can be replaced and removed without damaging the rock, unlike the baton. And Chouinard promoted this new approach very aggressively, writing a whole entire essay on clean climbing that ran in their 1972 catalog. And it worked, 100%, it worked. Climbers adopted those new techniques quickly because it meant that the places that they loved would survive for longer. Within a few years, chocks had almost entirely replaced batons as the standard for clean climbing. Now, think about what happened here. A company identified that its core product was causing harm. The founders admitted it openly. They advocated for their customers to stop buying the thing that was making them money, and they offered a better alternative. That's not how most businesses operate nowadays. That's not even close to how most businesses work behind the scenes. And yet, it established a pattern that would define Patagonia for the next 50 years. In 1970, Chouinard had begun importing rugby shirts from England for himself and fellow climbers. This is because they were durable, brightly colored so you could see other people on the mountains, perfect for climbing because they had a collar that prevented the gear that they would usually wrap around themselves to stop them from falling from rubbing on the neck, and other climbers wanted these shirts. Then, in 1973, he formally started a separate clothing company from Chouinard Equipment called Patagonia, named after the remote, windswept region at the southern tip of South America, like the ultimate frontier for climbers. The clothing line started because there was a genuine need for these clothes. Climbers needed functional apparel, not like fashion. They're not buying this premium. It's not a marketing thing. It's just actual gear that would hold up in the hard conditions that climbers need. Again, this business followed genuine need. The product came from Chouinard's lived experience. Patagonia's early clothing was functional, colorful, and durable. It didn't do anything else than that. All it was built for was to fill a gap in the market that Chouinard understood better than any other corporate strategist could have because he lived inside of that gap. And this caused the company to grow. I mean, it's not like they grew explosively, but steadily. Like, word spread between the dirtbags to other outdoor communities that Patagonia's products were durable, held up, were colorful, looked good, and everything, and that the company actually cared about the sport and what they were making. But Chouinard remained uncomfortable. That discomfort with success, growth, the whole premise of running a company is actually one of the most interesting things about it. A lot of founders are reluctant at first and then embrace their entrepreneur identity. Chouinard never really did. He remained suspicious of it. He continued to view the business primarily as a vehicle for enabling the kind of life that he and his community wanted to live, not as the end of his ambition itself. All right, so next let's talk about Patagonia's internal culture, because I think it's genuinely strange by modern corporate standards. Most companies, as they grow, start to adopt an idea of professionalism. Dress codes, hierarchy, formal meeting structures, HR departments. The logic is that you need consistency and accountability as you scale a company globally. Chouinard entirely rejected this idea. His guiding idea was that work should support a meaningful life, not the other way around. That the point of building a company wasn't to extract maximum productivity from his employees, it was to create something sustainable. People could do good work that actually means something and still have space to live their life outside of that. But what did this look like in practice? Employees could leave during the workday to surf if the waves were good, with the understanding that they'd make up work sometime else when the waves weren't. The Patagonia headquarters in Ventura, California was famously informal. Meetings were held outside. The dress code was pretty much wear what you would go to go hiking because the meeting is going to be in the forest, you know? They also built an on-site childcare center in 1983, which is one of the first American companies to do this. Chouinard himself has said this was one of the best business decisions they ever made because it allowed them to retain talented people, specifically women, who might have otherwise had to choose between a career and having a family. And the leadership structure was flat. There was no hierarchy like typical corporate companies do have nowadays. Chouinard was not interested in building a corporate chain kingdom. He was famously disorganized, more comfortable on a river than in a boardroom meeting. He hired people who were better at him in the things that he didn't want to do, and then just sort of got out of their way. Now, I kind of want to be careful here because it's easy to romanticize all of this. Not every Patagonia employee has had the perfect experience. The company has definitely faced many criticisms over the years around labor practices in its supply chain, around the gap between its stated values and the realities of how they actually practice business. No company is perfect, and that's an important truth. But the cultural philosophy Chouinard articulated, that the purpose of a business is not to maximize work, but to support a meaningful life, that idea is worth sitting with, because most organizations operate on exactly the opposite assumption, and their employees and the people that look into these companies feel it. Here's where things get philosophically interesting. Patagonia is an outdoor apparel company, which means it needs people to buy things, which means it is structurally a participant in consumer culture. But Chouinard has always been deeply ambivalent about consumer culture. He came from a climbing ethic in the dirt bags that valued minimalism. You carried only what you need. You didn't accumulate gear for having a hoarding stash you could use on any mountain. You repaired things rather than replacing them. You respected limits, like physical limits, material limits, ecological limits, like his batons. And you didn't do everything just to earn money because money was a means to an end to climb. And as Chouinard's understanding of environmental damage deepened, that tension became harder and harder to ignore. By 1991, Patagonia had been going rapidly for years. And then, almost overnight, the company hit a financial wall. A credit crisis forced Patagonia to lay off over 20% of their staff, which was only around 120 people at the time. But despite this low number, Chouinard has described this moment as one of the most painful moments of his business life. But it also forced a reckoning. After the layoffs, Chouinard took the leadership team on a retreat to ask a fundamental question. Why does Patagonia exist? What are we making this company for? And the answer they came to has shaped the company for the next 30 years until now. Patagonia exists to use business as a tool for positive environmental change, not to maximize profit, not to achieve market dominance over outdoor apparel, to do less harm and to use the platform that they have over all climbers for doing less harm more broadly. And that clarity in their goals changed how they made decisions. Instead of the question being, what will grow as fastest, the question was more, what is consistent with what we believe? Next, let me tell you about an advertisement that Patagonia ran in 2011. It was Black Friday, the single biggest shopping day in every American's calendar. Patagonia took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, and the headline read, "Don't buy this jacket." Below was a photograph of one of their best-selling fleece jackets. They laid out the environmental cost of making it, the water used, the carbon emitted, the waste generated, and they explicitly asked people to think twice before buying, to consider whether they really needed it, to repair what they had, to buy used if they did not need something new. For a company whose revenue depends on people buying jackets, this is honestly a crazy thing to do. And the debate that it sparked in the business world was exactly what you'd expect. Half the people thought it was brilliant marketing, a counterintuitive stroke of genius that would make people trust Patagonia more and therefore buy more jackets. And the other half thought it was more naive or hypocritical. You can't tell people not to buy your product while also being a business that needs people to buy your product. And I think personally that both critiques have a lot of validity because Patagonia's sales did increase after the campaign. So was it marketing? Probably partly. Yeah, I think so. Chouinard has been upfront that he doesn't think Patagonia is free of contradictions. The company is not a non-profit. It exists in a capitalist market economy. It sells things. Revenue matters. But here's what I find genuinely interesting about that ad, regardless of how you read it. They ask the question. Most companies never ask the question. Most companies operate on the premise that more consumption is always better, that growth is always the goal, that encouraging customers to buy less is not possible. It's not a move available to them. Patagonia put that question on the front page of the New York Times. And in doing so, they invited customers into a different kind of relationship, one based on not desire, not tempting customers into buying new things, but on honesty about the costs of what we buy and own. That's unusual. Might not be a perfect strategy, but it's definitely unheard of in the business world today. Let's talk about growth for a moment, because Chouinard's relationship with growth is one of the most striking things about his strategy. In most business conversations, growth is treated as a default goal. Bigger is better, more revenue, more stores, more customers, more scale, more locations. The assumption is that if you're not growing, you're dying, you're stagnating. Chouinard questioned this assumption explicitly and repeatedly. He worried, and this is worth quoting closely from one of his interviews, that growth changes the thing you're growing. That as companies scale, the culture that made them good gets diluted. The quality that made the products worth buying gets compromised. The values that made the people want to be there in the first place gets rationalized away in the name of efficiency. But Chouinard never did this. He saw this happen to other companies, and he was very afraid of it happening to Patagonia. So, rather than pursuing growth as his goal, Patagonia only grew when it made sense. When there was genuine demand, when quality could be maintained, when the growth wouldn't compromise the culture, when the growth wouldn't destroy the mission that Patagonia was fighting for all along. Now, this is almost impossible to do in modern economy, because companies have investors, companies have stakeholders, companies have employees that depend on the company's continued expansion. Now, Patagonia avoided the first problem by refusing outside investment for most of its history, only very recently. Chouinard kept the company private and owned by his family. That gave him the freedom to make decisions that public shareholders almost certainly would not have tolerated. And I mean, that's a luxury that most founders can't have, but it's worth noting because so many of the pressures that lead companies astray come from investor dynamics, from quarter quotas, from growth mandates, the pressure to sacrifice long-term values for short-term performance because that's what will please your investors. Chouinard completely denied that system, and that's what gave him room to be strange and be successful. By the late 1980s and 90s, Patagonia's environmental commitments had moved from philosophy to policy. In 1986, Chouinard committed Patagonia to donating 1% of sales, not 1% of profits or income, 1% of sales, to environmental organizations. Later, he co-founded an initiative called 1% for the Planet, which has expanded to include thousands of companies worldwide. In 1996, Patagonia switched entirely to organic cotton at significant cost and operational complexity because conventional cotton farming was one of the most pesticide-intensive agricultural practices in the entire world. They developed fleece made from recycled plastic bottles, began experimenting with recycled nylon and polyester, invested research into more sustainable materials across their supply chain, and critically started their worn wear program, repair and resale initiative that actively encouraged customers to repair garments rather than replace them, and to buy used Patagonia gear rather than new Patagonia gear. Now, think about that from a business perspective. Patagonia is running a resale program for used versions of its own products. Every used Patagonia jacket that gets sold through Wornwear is a new Patagonia jacket that doesn't get made and sold to a consumer. And they're not just tolerating this idea of a Wornwear program, they're actively promoting it and making it happen. They're setting up Wornwear trucks at events. They're making it easy and almost cool to buy secondhand. Why? Because the logic of environmental responsibility is genuinely at odds with the logic of endless consumption. And Chouinard chose environmental responsibility. Now, looking at this from a different perspective, critics will point out, and not unfairly, that Patagonia's gear is expensive. That the buy less, buy better philosophy is more accessible to wealthy customers than the people who can't afford a $300 jacket in the first place. That there's a class dimension to this kind of ethical consumerism that often goes unexamined. And I mean, that's a fair critique. Chouinard has acknowledged it, and it's one of the genuine tensions that the company hasn't fully resolved, and it's pretty hard to resolve, to be honest, in a capitalist society. But again, the fact that they're asking the question, wrestling with the contradiction, and trying to solve it rather than just papering over it and marketing or selling more jackets, That's what really distinguishes them from other companies. Now we come to what is probably the most extraordinary chapter of the story. In September 2022, Chouinard announced that he was giving Patagonia away. Not selling it, not taking it to the public market, not passing it down to his children to run as a family dynasty to make them money forever. He restructured the ownership so that the Patagonia Purpose Trust, which is what he made Patagonia into, it's a specifically designed trust, holds voting control over the company. And a nonprofit organization called the Holdfast Collective receives all of the company's profits that aren't reinvested into the business. The Holdfast Collective uses all of that money, it's roughly $100 million a year projected, to fight climate change and to protect wilderness. That estimated value of the company at the time was around $3 billion, and Chouinard and his family gave all of that away pretty much. This caused a lot of head scratching in the business world, and I understand why, because from a conventional perspective, it makes no sense to give away $3 billion. But from Chouinard's perspective, it almost makes sense beautifully. And I think this is the key, because the business was never about accumulating money. He has talked at length for hours about the difference between ownership and stewardship. Ownership, as most people understand it, is about possession and extraction. Something is mine, it's my property, and my goal is to take as much as I can from it. Stewardship is different. It says I'm responsible for this thing while I have it. My job is not to extract from it, but to take care of it and to leave it in a better shape than I found it. And Chouinard grew up in a climbing culture that understood the land this way. You don't own a mountain, you pass through it. You try not to damage it. You try to leave it for people who come after you. He applied that same logic to his company. Earth is now our only shareholder, is his writing when he announced his decision to give the company away. That sentence kind of sounds like a marketing line, to be honest, but given the actual legal structure he put in place to make the company voted on, the actual dollars involved, the hundreds of millions every year to give back to the environment, I think it's hard to dismiss this line as just marketing and just rhetoric. I want to connect this story as well to an idea that we've talked about before in this podcast, the distinction between finite and infinite games. A finite game is played to win. It has a defined end state, and the goal is to reach it before your opponent does. An infinite game is played to keep the game going, and the goal isn't to beat anyone. You just got to keep playing. Continue participating, sustain your enterprise to remain in play. I mean, sorry to go over that super fast. It's just that I've talked about it like 4 times before. So, tune into the prior episodes if you haven't heard that before. Most business is played as a finite game. The implicit goal in there is to accumulate enough money, to win market share, generate enough profit, achieve enough scale, and then you win. Chouinard was always playing a different game. He wasn't trying to beat competitors. He wasn't trying to achieve some terminal state of wealth or dominance where he could retire. He was trying to build something that could keep doing what it was supposed to indefinitely, and after he was gone. That meant building sustainability from the start of his company. It meant refusing to compromise culture for short-term gains. It meant ultimately restructuring ownership in his company in a way that made the company's mission legally binding forever, even after Chouinard is dead for years. He was trying to make Patagonia's values harder to undo than his own death itself. And I think that's quite possibly the most beautiful infinite game move possible. Here, I want to take a step back and try to articulate what the core of Chouinard's worldview actually is, because I think it's distinctive enough from any other CEO that it's enough to name it directly. Chouinard grew up in a climbing culture where few values were non-negotiable. One value is simplicity. You carried what you needed, not more. Excess weight was a problem, not a status symbol. Excess weight on a mountain means 5 more pounds and you could die. Quality over quantity. It's better to have 1 piece of gear that's excellent than 10 pieces of gear that are mediocre. This ties right back into the simplicity idea because it's just extra weight. Self-reliance. The mountain doesn't care about your excuses. You were either prepared adequately for your climb or you didn't, and that could be the difference between life or death. Respect for limits. The environment is not infinitely exploitable. The body is not infinitely exploitable. Nature is not infinitely exploitable. Anything pushed past its natural limits will eventually break, and you don't want to be there when it does. And you don't want to cause it to break either. Process over destination. The climb matters, not just reaching the summit. How you get there matters, not just whether you get there. This is the same thing as the last value almost. You have to leave the path open for those behind you. Now, let's look at these values and trace them through Patagonia's history. Simplicity. Patagonia resisted unnecessary growth and resisted unnecessary complexity in their product line. Quality over quantity. Patagonia builds expensive products that last. Patagonia launches their worn wear program where they can sell used things. Patagonia has a repair program where you can bring your coat in and get it repaired over buying a completely new one. Self-reliance. Patagonia relies on making its employees trusted and capable, not completely managed. They have their more informal policies. They have their outside meetings. They have flexible work times. So everyone gets their work done because they're able to live a life outside of work. Respect for limits. They make environmental commitments. They gave away the company completely, Chouinard gave away the company completely rather than pursuing his infinite accumulation of wealth under Patagonia. Like he could be pocketing that $100 million a year, but rather it goes towards the environment. Process over destination. How you build matters as much as what you build. And that's the idea behind Patagonia, that what he built is an amazing company that fights for the environment, but how he built it is just that it's important. If he had kept his company as the same Patan company that started out in the early 1960s, 70s, he would still be a company that's contributing to an environmental disaster in one way or another. He might have destroyed those same slopes and peaks that would serve to grow his company in the future. And I think the key thing here is that the values of the company were consistent. They didn't shift when it became profitable to shift them. They didn't shift when it became fun or convenient or just wanted to change at a whim. That coherence in values, that consistency between stated values and his actual behavior as the leader of his company is rare. And I think it's the most important explanation for how and why Patagonia has the power it has today. Now, there's a version of everything I've just said that becomes a certain argument for authentic branding. The idea that the lesson of Patagonia is have real values and customers will reward you. And I mean, I don't think that's entirely wrong. Authenticity and sticking to your values does matter. Coherence does compound in the mind of a customer. And people can usually sense when a company is just being performative rather than actually sticking to their values. But I want to push back on the marketing reading of this story because I think it misses the point entirely of Chouinard's legacy. Chouinard didn't build Patagonia's culture as branding. He built it because those were his actual beliefs. The business was downstream of the person. And the person had developed these convictions not from business school, not from reading Forbes as a child, but from decades of living outdoors, from direct experience of environmental destruction, from a climbing culture that taught him something real about how to see the natural world, how to see business, how to see life. And you can't reverse engineer that. You can't teach that because the story of Patagonia is unique. It's infinite. You can't read the story of Patagonia and decide to adopt authenticity as a strategy because authenticity by definition can't be adopted as a strategy. It either comes from somewhere real or it doesn't. The lesson isn't to be authentic. The lesson is to go deep into something that you love and something that's real and let the business follow. And that's a very different instruction. It's one that takes a massive amount of time. Chouinard spent years in the climbing world before business existed at all. He developed his values in places far from boardrooms and pitch meetings. The business was possible because the person and the values behind that person were already formed for years prior. Here's the question I think that Chouinard was always wrestling with and never fully resolved. Can you run a business without becoming the problem? Every business nowadays requires consumption. Every business requires resources. Every business generates waste and carbon and impact. And the question isn't whether you have impact. It's what kind and how much, and whether you're being honest about the trade-offs with your consumers. Chouinard tried to reduce impact as much as possible. He tried to make products that last long. He tried to encourage repair. He tried to use better materials. He donated enormous amounts of money to organizations fighting the harms you couldn't eliminate. He even gave $3 billion and $100 million a year to the climate crisis so that it could continue building even after his death. His mission remains legally protected because he gave up $3 billion to make it so. But none of this is even a perfect solution. He'd be the first to say this. And despite that, though, I think there's something in his attempt that I find moving. Like, most people in positions of power and wealth don't try. They make philanthropic gestures. They write checks to charities that give them naming rights to say, oh, this is the Jeff Bezos Fund or whatever. I don't know, bad name anyone, but they talk about sustainability in their annual reports while their supply chains run the same way they always have. Chouinard actually tried to restructure the thing, to make the values binding rather than optional to follow whenever you want, to ensure that the company couldn't just quietly drift back toward extraction like every other company does after he died. And I don't think that's nothing. I don't think you can dumb that down to marketing or authenticity or anything like that. I think that's a genuine person. That's his idea. So what's the one idea here? If I had to distill this episode down into one idea, I'd say this. The most durable businesses are built by people who care about the thing itself, not the market around it. Chouinard cared about climate, genuinely, obsessively, for decades before his business even existed. And from that genuine care, a set of values emerged that shaped everything downstream in his company. The quality of the products, the culture of the company, the relationship with the environment, the ultimate decision about what to do with his entire enterprise that he spent decades building. He didn't care about Patagonia as an apparel industry. He cared about it being in wild places, about the gear that made it possible, about the communities of people who lived on his gear, and about the national world that those places depended on and that life for the future depends on. And the business was solely the vehicle for those concerns. It wasn't the other way around. Most businesses take this idea backwards. They start with a market opportunity and then try to reverse engineer their meaning and culture and values into an entity that was never built around any of those things. And it shows. It always shows. The one idea is this: care about the right things first. The business will naturally follow if it's meant to be. And I mean, that's obviously easier said than done. You still have to understand the markets. You have to manage people. You have to handle finances. You have to try and beat your competition to some extent. And I mean, obviously, Chouinard was fortunate in many ways in having a partner and keeping the company private and operating in a singular moment in time where the outdoor industry was growing rapidly. But none of that luck, no matter how lucky he got, would have mattered if the foundation hadn't been genuine. Yvon Chouinard didn't set out to be a businessman. He set out to climb. And somehow, in the process of doing that honestly, he built something that outlasted all the strategies and formulas and best practices of people who never cared about anything except business itself. And I mean, I think there's something beautiful to learn in that. Thanks for listening to One Idea Away. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who's building something. And I'll see you next time.